Thanks, Malcolm. I think Malcolm introduced me as succinctly as it's possible to do, so we'll dive straight into this. I gave a very similar talk, only covering a different year last year, so this is really going to update us on what's what for this last year. Now, I had very much hoped that this report would have hit your doormats in print form by now, if you're a member of BC. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have done, unless anyone knows any different. I certainly haven't received mine. It's mailed out from Dorset, where the printers are, and they do the mailing out. So you'll have to take my word for it that it should be with you imminently, hopefully this week, weather permitting, obviously, and postal delays permitting. But this is what you'll see when you actually get the report this year. So let's have a quick look at take stock of last year. So these were where we got our records. Not quite as many as in 2020. I think that was partly due to the weather. Obviously in 2020 during lockdown, lots of people went out on their local exercise walks and were rewarded with lots of records because of the wonderful weather. This year, I think this last year, 2021, was basically pretty well a rubbish year all the way through for weather, apart from a brief spell in mid-July when the weather did actually turn quite summery for a couple of weeks or so. Unfortunately, from my point of view, it was rather unfortunate because it's while I was recuperating from an operation. So I didn't actually get much further than the back garden over that period. But anyway, as you can see, we still exceeded 50,000 records received, a record being a butterfly or one or more butterflies in a particular place on a particular date. In fact, that number will be higher now since I put the talk together. There's been a few more records have drifted in. But you can see we've still got an impressive number of well over 3,000 recorders, and they vary from people who have done transects, people who go out and wander around the countryside recording lots of areas, people who wander around one particular favourite site and record lots over the year. And then when you add in all the other bits and pieces, it still comes to quite an impressive amount. As you can see, the Big Butterfly Count, which obviously is BC's flagship citizen science project, gives us the biggest amount of records. It accounts for about 40% of the records. Like any citizen science project, you get people who are very experienced and people who are quite inexperienced, and unfortunately every year we have to knock out some of those records because they're quite plainly incorrect. But it's still a lot of useful records, especially from urban areas, which Herts and Middlesex has many. Increasingly, people are using iRecord to put in records, the system that you can use, and the various other things like iNaturalist that feed into that. That's very useful because a lot of people attach photographs to those records, which obviously helps my job in validating the records. We still get best part of 8,000 records sent to us or sent to me, mainly in spreadsheets, but occasionally in letters, Word documents, odd scraps of paper, all sorts of things. Then we have the transect records. This is the gold standard site recording and site monitoring system. It's been going for many years. This year, there were about 70 transects walked, and that produces obviously a lot of records between April and September, where really well covered transects are walked once a week. And then there's a good number of records which are sent into the branch website, which Peter Clark looks after very well, and thankfully puts all the records that come in into a database from which I can download information very easily. And those website records don't include any that are duplicated in any of the other systems. BTO's Garden Bird Watch, where people can record other organisms besides birds. That's contributed quite a lot of records this year. It's not always the easiest survey to get records from, but I did manage to do that this year, for this last year and for a number of prior years. Then we have much smaller number because it's a much more limited thing, the wider countryside butterfly survey, and that makes up all the records that we're dealing with. I'll talk about moth records a little bit later when we get to a few slides about moths. So where are our records made or not made? This is a kind of heat chart which shows the key spots where people have been recording over 2021. So basically, the darker the colour on the left-hand map, the more records have come in. And it's not surprising that they tend to be the best sites, or ones where people do a lot of recording on the same site over a period of time. So we've got a hot spot up at places like Thurfield Heath, right at the top, with red blobs. We've got a purpley brown blob, which is the highest number over at Albury Knowers in the west, and various other blobs representing either good sites or where people do a lot of recording. And you can see that there are some white gaps on there, and these are pulled out on the right-hand map, and this is really our targets for 2022. So the very dark blue represents no records received for, and I should say these are 2 kilometre squares. So no records received, and as usual, the worst area is northeast Hertfordshire, the aptly named arable desert. But at least it's arable. Whether it's really a desert is another matter. But people tend to be put off because of its very rural, very intensively agricultural nature. But as a number of correspondents have noted to me, if you go out there and actually look, it's quite interesting what you can see. There are bits of woodland, there are conservation margins to a lot of the fields. There's areas that have been left set aside. So it's well worth exploring these areas because you never know what you might find, and you'll actually be adding to our knowledge. I wouldn't worry so much about the little dots that go around the edges of Hertfordshire and Middlesex, because they often represent squares which are only partially in our area, or in some cases only a tiny amount in our area. So they may well be well covered by recorders in Bedfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Surrey, Essex, Cambridgeshire. But you can see that Hertfordshire has a lot more poorly covered areas than does Middlesex, which is quite interesting. And I think that's, again, as I mentioned, a reflection of the big butterfly count, where a lot of people in London are recording in their local patches. So and just to bring up, well, I don't know why it didn't come up at the same time, that map to show you where the particular locations are. So the grey areas are the urban areas, the white areas on the left-hand map are the rural areas. And again, you can see quite a correlation between unrecorded areas and the most rural areas, which tend to be the ones with the most intensive farming. So given that last year was, by any stretch of the imagination, a pretty rubbish year for weather, I've just put up these 6 charts to try and illustrate some of what the effect is generally on butterflies in the poor weather we had. Now, the black bars represent when things were flying last year, and the orange jagged lines represent the average flights, proportions of flight between 2005 and 2014. So if you like, what we call the long or the medium term normal. The Brimstone one is interesting because, as you can see, there was a bigger number recorded in the winter with the butterflies coming out of hibernation than there was in the autumn, which is normal. But you see, there are a whole load of peaks all through the spring, and that rather represents the short periods of good weather within the pretty awful weather that we had during March, April and May in 2021. The lucky thing is for butterfly recording is that butterflies like to be around when it's warm, dry, sunny and reasonably still. And that happens to be the time when recorders also like to be out and about. So unlike some other species, the recorder effect is pretty marginal because butterflies and people tend to like the same weather, which can't be said necessarily for birds, for instance. Now, the next two along, the marbled white and then going down one, the purple hairstreak, show the effect of that terrible spring, because you can see that emergence in both species was noticeably later because the black bars are pushed over towards the right of the long-term orange distribution. And that just shows how it took longer for things to develop, either as pupae or as caterpillars and pupae. If we go down to the small heath, that shows a huge summer population, huge proportion of the butterflies were flying in the summer, many more than normal, and a very broken up and small summer flight. And this could be for a number of reasons, one of which could be that, excuse me, one of these is that there wasn't so much time for the caterpillars to develop because the adults were flying late, and therefore the whole development was pushed onwards, possibly too late towards the end of the season. And if we go down towards the common blue, we can see again it's flying late and not flying early at all. And you can see that the highest peaks are in the spring rather than the summer. And this again probably reflects poor breeding success. And I'll be talking about the common blue in more detail a little bit later. And then the speckled wood, you can see that it's the usual pattern of increasing from the spring up to a peak in late August, early September. And that's absolutely as you might expect, but it's a rather more jagged distribution than the long term, again, because of poor weather. And you can see how in April and May, the proportion of speckled woods compared to the rest of the ones that flew later in the year was very small. And again, we're reflecting the very poor spring that we had in 2021. So let's go on and look at some species, and let's have a look at some optimistic news. This is the Duke of Burgundy. Now, it is a long time since the Duke of Burgundy was recorded in Hertfordshire, which is why this is so exciting. Apart from one odd record recorded in a garden in 2009, there haven't been any Duke of Burgundy records in Hertfordshire, and there are none in Middlesex, since the late 1990s, when there was a small colony at Albury Knowers, which is the yellow spot you can see on the map. And we had 4 sightings of on 4 separate days. Whether there are 4 different individuals or the same individual 4 times, who can tell? But the fact that this has actually returned to the site after many years of not being recorded is exciting, we hope anyway, because what we would want to achieve is breeding at Albury Knowers. The food plant is cowslip and sometimes primrose, but it has to grow in particular circumstances of shade and light, and the leaves have to be particularly large. Now there's a colony just north of Albury Knowers in the range of Pitstone Hills up to Ivinghoe Beacon, where it's a relatively common, well, not relatively common, that's not true. It's relatively frequent compared to Hertfordshire, and this is actually a very rare butterfly across the whole of the country. There were concerns not that long ago that it was going very much towards extinction, though it didn't. But we're hoping that this can be encouraged to continue its foothold in Hertfordshire and carry on. But it's very exciting to see something like this coming back after all these years. And we're certainly engaging with the wildlife, Herts Middlesex Wildlife Trust, to look at the management of the site for the benefit of the Duke of Burgundy. But obviously time will tell what's going to happen there. And there's a little bit of film of the Duke of Burgundy. You can see it doesn't actually do a lot. This is because the males, which is what you tend to see, spend a lot of time either patrolling, sort of sitting, looking for other males to fly off against, or just warming themselves up in the sun. It's quite a small butterfly. It used to be called the Duke of Burgundy fritillary, but it's not related to fritillary. It's actually a metal mark, which is a mainly tropical group of butterflies. So let's go on to the brown hairstreak, which is another recent arrival in our area. At this time in Middlesex, you can see it hasn't quite yet got into Hertfordshire, though it has been recorded up near the border. It's found at a number of different sites each year, mainly through egg hunts. You can see once you get your eye in, you can find the eggs. In the winter, it's getting towards the end of the season for looking for eggs now, because once the flowers start forming white on the blackthorn, then the white eggs obviously are much more hidden, and obviously they'll start hatching out as the weather gets warmer. But a reliable place to actually go and see them is the area around the Stafford Road open space in Ruislip Gardens, northwest London. And there's a little bit of video which I'll run while I'm talking, just to show what they do. And again, it tends to be often the males that you see sitting low down or patrolling. You never know whether you're going to find the adults or not. There was a field trip. These were taken on the day of the field trip, a branch field trip, and the people on I'd actually gone up there coincidentally, and people on the field trip had no. I'd had quite a bit of luck, but luckily I was able to take people along to where I'd seen them, and we soon got some excellent views of they're all male brown hairstreaks, nectaring quite low down on thistle and bramble, as you can see from the photos. It frequently doesn't open its wings, so as you can see from the middle picture, it will sometimes. And it has to be said, the underwing is, in the male, is considerably more interesting than the upper wing. The female has much more orange and chestnut on it than the male does. But it's great that this is expanding, but the branch is very concerned to engage with landowners on all the sites where it's been found to try and get good maintenance of blackthorn hedges, because too much cutting, too much strimming and or flailing, and that's the end of the brown hairstreak because the eggs go. But it's certainly now quite well distributed, especially in West Middlesex, and quite a success. It's actually been spreading up through Surrey for some time to hit our area, and I don't think it'll be long before we do find that they've sneaked across the border into Hertfordshire. And another species which has been spreading, the small blue, this was extinct, well, absent, I should say, rather than extinct, from about 2003 for several years before it was refound at this area called the fields behind Hillbrow in Letchworth. And it's now been recorded at quite a few places. Particularly, there were some new sites up right in the north of the county, just to the east of Royston, where farmers have planted fields of wildflowers, including a lot of kidney vetch, which is its sole food plant. It seems to be able to find from quite a distance kidney vetch when it's actually planted. So here's a bit of video as well while I'm talking. And there are a number of sites now where it can be found, mainly in the west and north of the county. And again, we try and work with landowners to ensure that sites are kept in good condition. Certainly up at Letchworth, there were some great concerns about the state of the site that was beginning to scrub over, but it has been de-scrubbed this winter, or sorry, last autumn, and we're hoping that this will have had a good effect on kidney vetch growth this summer. We shall see. And let's go on to some more common butterflies and see what they've done. The brimstone's quite interesting because it's obviously it's a common butterfly. You don't very often see it apart from on the very chalky areas in great numbers. But normally it's pretty constant. It doesn't vary much in numbers on transects. It doesn't vary much in its distribution across the county, the counties. But for some reason, it liked 2020, and the emergence in the spring was quite strong, and well seen again in the summer when the new brood emerged. And this is one of the few butterflies that actually increased both its distribution and abundance during 2021. So there was some good news. And yes, that's fine. So that's a success. Have a look at feeding away there. As you see, quite strongly attracted to flowers, but often just seen flying. The males can often be seen flying around looking for females, and the females flying around looking for alder buckthorn or buckthorn, which is a a rather insignificant looking shrub, which often grows hidden away in hedgerows. You wouldn't notice it, but they can smell it out from a distance. So the purple emperor, obviously something of a, what can you say about the purple emperor? It's one of those, it's the butterfly that most people want to see, despite its fairly unpleasant habits when the males land on the ground and examine droppings, or in the bottom, in the video down the bottom, just wet ground. It's had another good year. You can see there are a fair number of places where it's been seen right across the two counties, particularly in Hertfordshire. And there's a good chance that it can turn up not just in woodland, which is what it's usually associated with, but every year we get several reports of people finding them landing on their back lawn, coming into quite domestic, so because they will range far and wide across the landscape. So it is possible to sometimes see them with a bit of luck low down, rather than having to crane your neck up to look at them around the tops of trees. But obviously that's a very reliable way of finding them once you've identified the assembly areas that the males choose. And in contrast, the other big woodland butterfly, oops, I think I've mentioned this before, the white Admiral is having a torrid time. We did actually get reports from a couple more sites this year, but is very much now confined to just a few areas of woodland within our particular area. And the numbers in those particular areas of woodland are well down. On the two transect sites where it's monitored on a weekly basis, it's Bulls Wood and Bricket Wood, it has really not showing good numbers at all compared with a few years ago. And this is something that's reflected across much of southern England. It's not entirely clear why this should be, but this was again not a great year for the white Admiral, and it is much less encountered than the purple emperor. Okay, the white butterflies. So I've grouped these three together because their fortunes, not always, but often do move in sync. And 2020 was a good year for all of them. 2021 was still a good year for them all, not quite as good. But you can see that they're all very common. Again, you can see the gaps are in the arable areas, which may well be down to a lack of recording, given particularly the fact that they're often attracted to arable fields such as oilseed rape, where the large whites and small whites will try to breed. How much that breeding is successful, or how much the caterpillars get sprayed off by herbicide and insecticide applications is a moot point. But you can see that they're all pretty well covered. The green vein white, which doesn't feed on those sort of crucifers, but more on things like garlic mustard, is not quite as widely distributed, but it's still very common. And all three of these showed a slight decrease in slight decrease in distribution, but no real decrease in abundance. And small white, if I recall correctly, was quite common, particularly later in the year. The large white picture shows a caterpillar which has actually been parasitized by a wasp which lays its eggs, and the grubs hatch out, feed on the innards of the caterpillars, and then burrow their way out and pupate all around the husk of the caterpillar. Now, small tortoiseshell. First of all, what I think is an interesting fact, and that's almost certainly going to be a contrast to this year, and it shows something about the weather we had last year. February last year actually had some very mild and pleasant weather in it, and we actually had more records of the small tortoiseshell from February than we did from March 2021, which is quite remarkable, because normally butterflies tend to come out in numbers from about the 12th of March onwards. It seems to be a fairly constant figure. But of course, March wasn't a particularly good year, whereas, say, we had some decent weather in February. But to get more records of this species in February than March is very unusual. Its distribution was slightly down, and its abundance was slightly down on last year, but it didn't actually fare too badly. And it seems to be that the small tortoiseshell, certainly in our area, to some extent has always bucked the trend which has been noted and written up about in a lot of the country about a decline. And one of the factors that's been put forward for the decline is going to appear in the video in a minute, though there is now some doubt about whether it's responsible for all of it. And this is Sturmia bella, which is a parasitic fly, which is landing on this clump of caterpillars to have a look at them. See, it just looks like a housefly, basically. So let's look at the golden skippers. So this is the three common skippers: the small, the Essex, and the large. Three species frequently mixed up by recorders. Often takes a little bit of working out what people are seeing. And this is the one, the one species group, at least between the small and the Essex skippers, that you're allowed to record as an aggregate. These figures here, these data here, doesn't include the aggregates. These are just confirmed versions of the species, and all of them have been in something of a decline for a number of years. And certainly in our area, there is some concern, I think it's fair to say, over them. They're still well distributed, but you can see there are tons and tons of gaps. There are still lots of open blue circles indicating places where they were seen in 2020 but weren't seen in 2021. And the large skipper is certainly the commonest of the three, but even there are quite a few gaps. And it is something of a concern. There are basically, they all feed on grasses, which obviously there's no shortage of grasses, so quite what is causing the problems is not clear, though undoubtedly the weather was probably the resulted in some of this year's problems. But they are butterflies which we're keeping a close eye on, because it's all very well to welcome in the ones that have done well in a particular year. You tend to notice that, but what it often is, and it's not just with butterflies, with other species, it's actually noticing what is in decline. And that's where all thousands of records that you and everyone else sends in, getting them on the database, getting them mapped, doing some analysis and stats, can help us at least get some early warning of where things might be going wrong, and for us to try and work out why that might be and what we can do about it. Okay, the painted lady. 2019 was, I've put there as a contrast with 2021, because 2019 was a pretty good year for the painted ladies. You can see there was a lot of coverage. 2020 was a much poorer year. 2021 wasn't what we call a painted lady year, in the sense it was a big invasion of them, because this is obviously a migrant butterfly which comes excuse me, which comes in each year from North Africa and Europe. But interesting thing about its distribution was normally we get an influx round about the end of May. and then they will breed through the summer, maybe have a couple of broods, probably get supplemented by further migrants, and increase in amount through the year. But this year, the painted lady, the May immigration, possibly again because of the very poor spring weather, didn't really happen. There were very few painted ladies in the country, and certainly in our part of the country, until about July. And so the chances are that they were primary migrants rather than the results of breeding by the very few that were here in the spring. So they actually fared quite well with those migrations. How much those summer migrations bred here, or whether they were supplemented by further influxes of painted lady, isn't clear. But it wasn't actually that bad a year for the painted lady. Okay, now I mentioned the common blue earlier in the talk, and I just want to come back to it with a bit more information. You can see that in 2020, the common blue, and it had been doing reasonably well for 2 or 3 years before that, after some pretty lean years. But in 2020, it was recording a lot of places. You can see by the proportion of open blue circles on this map that there are a lot of places where it's seen in 2020, it wasn't seen in 2021. And this species seems to have been particularly badly affected by the poor weather early on, which meant that there wasn't a lot of adults around to breed, which meant that as the summer went into summer and autumn, there weren't so many common blues to be seen. And given that this species does have a certain amount of cyclic nature to its abundance, we mustn't get too worried. But it is noticeable that probably did worse proportionately than pretty well any other of the common species that we have in our area. It flew late. Often we have to disentangle records from April, which are almost certainly holly blues, from common blues flying in May. This year there was very little difficulty doing that because there were hardly any common blues flying in May either, certainly the first half of May. So that's one to keep an eye on, particularly during 2022, and see what's happened to it. Okay, Chalkhill Blue. This is, as the name suggests, confined to the chalky areas very much along the boundary where the Chilterns just about get into Hertfordshire. And it had a really good year in 2013. It was the males particularly dispersed into quite a lot of new areas. Not obviously they didn't settle there because you need the females to disperse as well. But there was so much pressure on the population. After that, the numbers went down quite a lot. But over the last 2 or 3 years, the Chalkhill Blue has been doing better. In 2021, it actually had its best year for several years. I got 2 bits of data here which I think show that. First of all, on the Fairfield Heath site, which are the 4 red blobs up in the top right of the map, which is its real stronghold in Hertfordshire. They were up on the transects that walked across that site. There were 2 sites that did actually establish, that have actually established in recent years. The one at Ashwell Quarry, that's still running, and the colony which has grown up north of Baldock, next to the Baldock bypass, on all the chalk that was dumped there when they built the bypass and the tunnels. That's still thriving as well. So it has actually spread in terms of its distribution over the last few years, and all those new sites seem to be keeping going. And there was one record slightly off-site at Dudswell near Hemel Hempstead as well, of a male. But they often get, this is a frenzy. There you can. These are males which are they're attracted by a female, but they get so worked up but they end up fighting amongst themselves and leaving the female alone. Her pheromones obviously attract them, but like a lot of groups of young men, if there's a chance of a good fight, they'll go for that, and they can get quite seriously into having a bundle together. Every so often, one of them notices the female and chases the thing. But and the other factor I was going to say, at Hexton Chalk Pit, which is the other strong site, that's not monitored like Albury Knowers in quite the same way, but each year I try and get up there if I can in decent weather and walk a route several times and then average out the numbers. And the Hexton Chalk Pit numbers have gone up to, on this route, 88 last year. In 2020, last year it was 152, and that's up from the mid-30s in previous years. So again, it looks like they had a good year. This is one of the last adults to fly in the year. It doesn't normally start flying till the very end of June or the beginning of July. So perhaps it's less affected by poor weather in the spring because it takes it a long time to develop anyway. And now we've got the Adonis Blue, so the elephant in the room. As is well documented now, the Adonis Blue was found a couple of years ago at Fairfield Heath up on Churchill, which is a historic site for it, but historic in the sense it hadn't been recorded there for about 60 years before it suddenly appeared. And we strongly suspect that this was an undocumented release, probably of pupae, by someone who knew what they were doing. And it has to be said that the colony has actually gone from strength to strength. It's now spread over most of the Heath area, so not just on Churchill, but across the golf course, down onto the rifle range. Beautiful butterfly, and although we might disapprove of the way it's got there, it's certainly lovely to be able to go up there and see it flying in our area, and it is such an attractive bright blue butterfly. And these pictures are all from Churchill. It's just a mating pair. See, video of mating pairs of butterflies isn't actually that exciting really, because they just sit there and mate, but nonetheless, it always amazes me how butterflies can cling together even when it's quite windy. Okay, and the small heath. Now, this has had some good years recently. Last year, as you saw from the chart that I showed when we were looking at the effects of weather, seemed to do quite well early on, but it didn't seem to have a great deal of breeding success. You can see again that there are a lot of empty areas which were occupied in 2020. So I don't think we need to panic about it, but it certainly didn't end 2021 in such a good state as we might hope. Obviously, we'll see what happens in a few months' time. Small heath wandering around on a flower. Okay, every year there's a few oddities which I'd just like to bring up for a minute or two. Things that shouldn't be here, or things that are maybe migrants, maybe not. And so here we have the swallowtail, the large tortoiseshell, the long-tailed blue, and the black hairstreak. And these are all, as you can see, one-offs. Swallowtails may well be released. They could be primary migrants from the continent. They may be released by or escaped from breeders, who knows. Ditto the large tortoiseshell. Given that we're so far inland, it seems more likely that these are accidental releases rather than genuine migrants, especially if there isn't a lot of migrant activity on the coast. Long-tailed blue is at Alexandra Palace. We get these most years, but oft times they can be traced back to escapes from peas and beans that have been imported from East Africa with a caterpillar or a pupa inside them, and people have had them hatch out in their houses. They have actually bred a good few years ago now in London. And the black hairstreak here from Wormwood Scrubs in West London is a complete mystery, because there are no colonies anywhere near here. It's basically a butterfly of the East Midlands. There is a colony in Surrey, or there have been colonies in Surrey around Epsom, which were certainly the result of releases. But even so, Shepherd's area around the Wormwood Scrubs near Shepherd's Bush is a long way from Surrey. So how the origin of all these is always a little bit odd, but it's interesting to note them and record them. So let's move on to the moths. A rather text-heavy slide. There's a reason for that. This is illustrates one of the things about moths compared to butterflies. Obviously, with butterflies, there's only 59 species regularly found in this country, and probably only 35 of them in Hertfordshire and Middlesex. Whereas with moths, the British list is about 2,700 now, of which about 1,600 have been recorded in Hertfordshire and Middlesex. And there are fewer people recording, and a lot of moths are harder to see. So this list, which is notably unillustrated, is because all these are what are called micro moths. They're very, very small moths in many cases, not particularly photogenic, and I haven't seen any of them, so I haven't got any photos of them. But you can see they turn up in various places, and it's quite interesting that in moths there is still a lot of movement around. I mean, some of these may have been around unnoticed for years, some of them won't have been, but that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 13 new species of moth added to Hertfordshire and Middlesex in 2021. And so I'm grateful to Colin Plant for this information. I can't show lots of charts for moths like I can for butterflies, because there are many, many more records of many, many more species, which therefore require a lot more sifting through. And Colin hasn't quite finished getting the database up to date so that I can produce maps. So that's why this is a rather text-heavy list here. But it's interesting to note the volatility of moths compared to butterflies. But what about existing moth species? Well, just like in butterflies, we get declines, and it's important to try and note those. And not surprising, in 2021, there were rather fewer species increasing in numbers than there were decreasing. So what I did was I took the records in my trap and from a couple of the other committee members who trap most nights of the year. And one of the things about 2020 and 2021 is there's been very little to stop anyone trapping most nights of the year, because it hasn't been very easy to go away. So these examples that I'm going to show you in a moment are some moths that are both increasing and declining based just on those 3 continuing effort sites. And I would not say a comprehensive list, and when I asked for lists, everyone came up with slightly different things, but there were a few things that most people had in common. So these are all common moths that seem to be declining. We have over here at the top left the Hebrew character, which has begun to fly this year already. It's still quite common, but the numbers are much smaller than in the last few years. And next to that we have the Heart and Dart, which flies in late spring, early summer, and its numbers have declined probably by about 50%. The Buff Ermine, which had got quite common, one of the tiger moth group, is the orangey yellow moth with the black spots still at the top, and that seems to have gone down. And then one of our most obscurely marked moths, the dot moth on the right, you can just see if you look carefully that there is a triangle of 3 black dots on the grey background, and that used to be a lot more common than it is now. And it's very difficult to understand why these moths are actually declining. Ditto the double square spots. Its name's pretty self-explanatory down at the bottom. In the middle is the large ranunculus, which is generally, in my garden, certainly what used to be one of the commonest autumn moths. They fly October, November. And this year, people were seeing hardly any. Now, whether that's got something to do with just the weather conditions that we had during the year, or it's something wider, we just can't tell at the moment. And then on the bottom right, the excuse me, buff arches, which again seems to have declined as summer flying moth. But it's just the kind of things that if we don't keep a note of what's declining as well as celebrate what's increasing, we could suddenly find we're in the house sparrow starling situation that birds have been in. But there are some moths that are increasing, and these are just a few examples. We've got the dingy footman. That's actually the yellow form of it. There is a grey form as well. The straw underwing, green carpet, it's a very attractive moth when it's fresh. The white spot down at the bottom there, which used to be very much a migrant and is now pretty well established across the whole, certainly of Hertfordshire and Middlesex. The least carpet, which used to be more common in urban areas than of London, is now spread well into Hertfordshire. It's been doing that for a number of years. And down the bottom, it's the same moth, despite the difference. There's quite a difference in shading of colours, the treble lines. So at least some moths are increasing. And again, it's not always clear why some are increasing and some are decreasing, but it's something that we need to bear in mind. And perhaps when we get the detailed data from all the moth records, when they've all been put together, we may be able to see more reason why that should be. So it's now time to prepare for the takeoff of the 2022 recording season. As mentioning in the preliminary chat, we have already seen a few butterflies this year and a few moths, not large numbers, and I don't think the next few days are going to bring large numbers of butterflies or moths. If anything with any sense, we'll be hunkered down in tree trunks and bottom of clumps of grasses or in outhouses and sheds, and keeping their head well down for a while. But anyway, that's fairly whistle-stop summary of what happened in 2021. And thanks for listening. I'm very happy to take any questions if you have any.
Great. Well, thanks, Andrew. That was a really interesting talk. We've clearly got a lot going on with the different butterfly and moth species that we've got around at present. And as you say, it's not always very easy to understand why one's doing well and one's doing badly. I don't think we've got any questions in the chat yet, but if anyone would like to ask a question, then please do unmute yourself and show your video if you want to. But if there are any questions for Andrew, please let us know. Oh, I can see one from Paul Busby.
All right, yes, the Jersey tiger was added to Brig Butterfly Campus. Any plans for a branch map? Yeah, well, there is a branch map in the sense that if you go to the Hertfordshire Moth Group website, you will see maps covering our branch for all the species of moth that are recorded here. That's the Hertfordshire Moth Group. But the maps on there at the moment are for 2020 or leading up, the years up to 2020. As I say, when Colin Plant, who's the moth recorder for the area, my equivalent for moths, has finished getting all the data onto the database, which does take quite a long time, then he will send me a copy of that and I will fairly quickly be able to produce maps and they'll go up on that website. But yeah, certainly the Jersey tiger continues to be expanding and doing well. So there is no, I don't think we've got any worries on that score. It's interesting, just talking about tigers, that although the garden tiger has pretty well disappeared from our area, the scarlet tiger, which does fly in the day and in the night, is actually increasing from the west, coming in from the Chiltern area, and has been seen in more places each year than previously, and that's a very attractive tiger moth.
You've got a supplementary question from Paul, who's wondering whether numbers went up as a result of the extra record. I guess that's been meaning the big butterfly included in the big butterfly count.
Yeah. I would imagine so, yes, but until we actually see all the data, because I only see the butterfly records from the big butterfly count. Colin gets the moth records, so but I've got no reason to think that wasn't the case. And certainly when you get into July and August, I think both myself and Colin, I think Liz as well, if we get more emails and very regular emails querying what this wonderful butterfly is that people have seen in their back garden, they can't find in the books, and everything says it's very rare because it's only found in southwest England or in the Channel Islands. So yeah, I'm sure that is probably the case. And thanks to Liz for putting up the link to the map.
I was just about to say, I've put it up. It shows a fairly solid block in Middlesex.
Yeah, because it's spread up from just south of the river, so it's covered Middlesex and it's rapidly expanding through Hertfordshire.
Well, I heard of one being seen in St Albans this year, but I've still yet to see one here myself. So I'm very jealous of those people like Liz who've had hundreds of them in their garden.
I wouldn't get too jealous. After a while, it's you go up in the morning, you go, oh no.
What's your record total so far?
Oh, I'll tell you. I'll just have a look on my database. I'll come back to you on that one. I don't want to give false information.
All right, Brian, did you want to ask a question? As you saw, no, okay. Well, I had a question I wanted to ask Andrew, which was, it's fantastic. We've seen Duke of Burgundy arrive in Hertfordshire, presumably under its own steam. Though don't know for sure. But do you what do you think would be the next butterfly that will get established in Herts and Middlesex?
Well, that's a very good question. In Hertfordshire, one hopes it'll be the brown hairstreak, as I've mentioned, sneaking up from Middlesex, and there must be some sight as it is so close to the border. I mean, having been seen as far north as White Webbs Wood and Darlands Lake in Middlesex over the last couple of years. I mean, that is really just almost literally a stone's throw from Hertfordshire. Other species, difficult to say. I mean, if you mean coming in naturally,
Yeah.
I don't know if there is much left on the menu that is likely to get up here, where there are reasonable environmental conditions and food plants and so on, because other species like that, the black hairstreak or the Heath fritillary, although they're in southeastern England or eastern England, they're still quite a long way from Hertfordshire.
There's the silver spotted skipper. There's a possibility, I suppose.
Yeah, it could come in from Chiltern direction. It's possible. There have been odd ones seen, but quite where they've come from, it is difficult to tell. Just to say, I have screen shared that map of the Jersey tiger.
Okay.
Which is up to 20. Yes, so I should say the square blobs on that represent records from 2016 to 2020. So you can see how it's a recent arrival. The round blobs are 2010 to 2015. So you can see what a recent arrival it is in most areas. But you can see it has definitely both in Middlesex and Hertfordshire an eastern bias, which is probably why you haven't seen one in St Albans yet, Malcolm. But I think it will begin to fill in.
Looks like it goes up the River Lee, to be honest. My maximum count one morning last year was 160.
Goodness me.
Yeah.
That is so unfair. Okay, can we stop screen sharing that now?
Yeah.
Oh.
That's better. There we go.
Right. Did anyone else have a question? No sign of one. Okay, well, in that case, I'll just say thank you very much to Andrew. Just a couple of notices before we go. The photographic competition, the branch photographic competition, is now open, and that Peter Clark is organising it this year, who runs our sightings page on the website. So if you want to enter, then please email your photos to Peter Clark before the 12th of March. There's details of the rules, such as they are on the website, which lists all the different categories we've got for the photos. And we will be having voting open after the 12th of March, which again, we'll be asking everyone to go onto the branch website, look at the photos there, and help us choose which the best ones are in the different categories. The other thing I did want to mention was our next talk, which is on Tuesday, the 8th of March. This is another one we're doing jointly with Surrey and South West London branch. They're hosting it, so it's one that needs to be booked in advance. It's on the Brilliant Butterflies project, which is, for those that don't know, is an amazing project that's been running in South London, in Croydon and Bromley over the last few years. Building a huge number of new sites for chalk loving butterflies, particularly the small blue, but also some of the other chalk butterflies they've got down there. The downs around Bromley and Croydon had probably got into a fairly sorry state, and certainly weren't pristine chalk grasslands of yesteryear, but they have had a lot of work done to them. And this is a project Butterfly Conservation have been heavily involved with the Wildlife Trust and the Natural History Museum, where over £1 million is being spent on habitat creation. So it's a really inspirational project, and one well worth looking at. But as I say, it does need you to book in advance. We've sent the Eventbrite links round, but they'll also be available through the website if you want to book for it. That is starting at 7 o'clock in the evening. So if there's nothing else, it just leaves me to say thank you all for coming, and yeah, see you again next time.
Hi everyone.
Thanks.
Cheerio.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Bye.